right, thank you. It's good to be back with you today. We're grateful for your prayers while we were gone and look forward to the fellowship that we're enjoying already back with you. So thank you for keeping track and praying for us while we were gone. If you have your Bibles, we're in John chapter 21 this morning. We were finishing, concluding our study of the Gospel of John, and we're today in the very last passage of the book, John 21, verses 15 through 25 to the end of the book. This has been a good study, I hope, in the Gospel of John, looking at Jesus in the upper room discourse as he's teaching his disciples, and then through his crucifixion and resurrection. And then the past few weeks, we've seen stories of his appearances after his resurrection, and so we'll continue that this morning. What I'd like to do is read through this passage. I'll lead us in prayer, and then we'll look at it together. John 21, beginning in verse 15. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back against him during supper and had said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about this man?" Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." So the saying spread abroad among the brothers that this disciple was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Now there are also many other things that Jesus did, were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Let's go to the Word of prayer. Father, we thank you for this opportunity to look into your Word. We ask for eyes to see and hearts to hear and receive the truth that is found here. We ask for your blessing now in our time together, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. As I noted at the beginning, we're appreciative of those who followed our travels as we were overseas. We got to go to a lot of different spots, and specifically where we were for 2 weeks was in Uganda. It's not a country that I had ever been to. I had been to Africa twice before, but not particularly to Uganda. And so it was a unique experience. But when we landed at the airport and we were leaving the airport, we were immediately presented with Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria is a fairly famous landmark in Africa. And I was reminded at that moment that one of the famous missionaries in that part of Africa was a man named David Livingstone, who had actually died just across the way, just across the lake in what is now Tanzania, late in his ministry. And I wanted to begin this morning just by thinking about his life for a moment and that of another famous missionary by the name of William Carey. David Livingstone, when he went to Africa, it was a very difficult time. In fact, he was one of the first Englishmen who had ever been to parts of Africa, and dealing with some of the challenges was difficult for him. On one particular trip, he was attacked by a lion that mauled him and left his left arm unusable throughout the rest of his life. But he dealt with a lot of sickness. His wife came to join him at one point, and she soon succumbed to disease. He also lost one of his sons in the Civil War in the United States. Although Livingston was British, his son had come to America to fight on the side of the North because Livingston was an abolitionist, and his son also believed in that cause, and he died in battle just 4 months before the war ended. So Livingston had gone through a lot of difficulty. He initially was going to go to China, but he had been convinced by Robert Moffat that the need was so great to come to Africa. And it's there that his servants one day found him at the age of 60. He had died while kneeling in prayer. And due to the embalming processes, they ended up burying his heart in Africa and then taking his body to be laid to rest in Westminster Abbey. But another missionary that has always been a hero of mine is William Carey. William Carey is sometimes called the father of modern missions. And he had a tremendous struggle when he first went to India. He was beset with malaria, and the disease was so bad he was bedridden along with his whole family, and his 5-year-old son succumbed to the disease. But because he was in an area where, because of the caste system, no one would touch a dead body, he himself had to get up and construct the coffin and literally crawl at times to bury his son with his own hands. During this time, his wife also sort of, she got an illness that would essentially confine her to bed for the rest of her life. And Carey wrote of this in his diary, and I just wanted to read a few things that he wrote in his diary on February 5th. He said, "I drown my heaviness of heart by writing to England." On February 7th, he said, "Oh, that this day could be assigned to oblivion." And on March 14th, he said, "Mine is a lonesome life." But perhaps one of the most difficult ordeals he went through was when, on March 12, 1812, the printing press that he had built burned to the ground. And in that fire, he lost all the manuscripts that he had been working for years and years on. He had been writing a letter to his nephew about how missionary work brings joy and the Lord's blessing, and he left off and then picks up the letter after that to say, "I've just received news that the printing press has burned to the ground," and he said, "We'll probably never recover the losses that we've made." And this is the last note he wrote on that letter, and I just wanted to read it and to think about this. He said, "God will no doubt bring good out of this evil, but at present the providence is exceeding dark." And we may often go through times in our lives where we feel like God's providence is exceeding dark. What is God doing in our lives? How is God really bringing good out of evil? Is there hope for us and for the future? And I think that the disciples were probably much in this vein themselves. You remember that after Jesus' death, they were kind of cowering in an upper room, frightened about the consequences of what would ensue, because Jesus had been essentially crucified as an enemy of the state, and all those who were associated with him fell under the shadow of this insurrection kind of taint that seemed to be attached to Jesus. And so they wondered, would good be able to come out of this? They had expected Jesus to establish a kingdom, to be the one who would rid them for once and all of the Roman power. But instead, he had been crucified as a common criminal. And so, Jesus, after his resurrection, appears to them several times. And I think in this particular scene that we see here at the end of the Gospel of John, it's probably in many ways Jesus' most compassionate, gracious, and tender appearance after his resurrection, because in this particular appearance, he's going to restore Peter publicly back to a place of prominence and back as a lead minister of the gospel in the church that he is going to establish on the day of Pentecost. When we think about Peter, we know that Peter was the kind of guy that always rushed in when others would hesitate. We noted several weeks ago the contrast between Peter and John. John seemed to be the introvert who would sort of hang back and think through things carefully. Peter's the kind that would rush in, often make a mistake. Sometimes my favorite saying that I think I've said before is that when it says in the gospel, Peter didn't know what to say, and so he said. He's always the one to say it, even if he doesn't know exactly what he's doing. But here Jesus appears to Peter, and I think there's a lot of significance in this appearance that I want to try to draw out as we think about it together. One thing, though, that I think is interesting to consider is, as we study the Gospels, I think there's evidence that Jesus has actually already appeared once to Peter prior to this incident. The reason that I say that is there are two accounts outside the Gospel of John that seem to suggest this. One is in Luke 24. In Luke 24, this is the famous passage where the two disciples on the road to Emmaus are joined by Jesus, and then they finally recognize him when he breaks bread and blesses it, if you remember this story. Right prior to that account, it says that Peter went to the tomb and he saw the linen cloths that Jesus had been wrapped in, and he went home amazed at what he had seen. Then Luke switches to that account of the two on the road to Emmaus. What's interesting about that is after they recognized Jesus, it says they rushed back to tell the disciples what had happened. This is a 7-mile journey, so they had already gone 7 miles, and now they go 7 miles back to tell the disciples. When they get there, verse 34 says that the disciples told them, "Simon has seen the Lord." Luke 24:34. What I take this to mean is that the disciples who were gathered there in the upper room told these two disciples that came from Emmaus that Simon had already seen Jesus. But we're not given that story. That story, in other words, isn't recorded in Luke 24. We're just told that Simon had seen Jesus. We can correlate this, though, with 1 Corinthians 15. In 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul says that Jesus appeared, he was raised from the dead on the third day, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12. And if we take those two passages together, I think what this is signifying is that the Gospels don't tell us, but at some point, Jesus probably privately appeared to Peter to restore him in some sense, because Peter had denied him 3 times. If you betrayed a friend, that would be a difficult thing to be restored from. It would take some time, it would take some healing. So I think Jesus appeared first to Peter privately at some point, and we're not given that full story. But here, Jesus appears to the disciples, and he has a specific conversation with Peter. And I think the point of this particular passage is that although Peter has probably been restored privately, he's now restored publicly. And John draws in certain themes. Remember, I had mentioned this, but when they come onto the beach where Jesus has appeared, there's a charcoal fire there, it says in verse 9. That same word is only used twice in the New Testament, and it's used in the account of Peter's denial of Jesus. He was warming himself by a charcoal fire when he denied Jesus 3 times. And now here, they're by a charcoal fire, and Jesus is going to restore Peter 3 times. And so Peter will be restored publicly. If the disciples had sort of questioned his loyalty, and we might expect that that would be the case after Peter had spectacularly denied Jesus 3 times in public, now Jesus is going to restore Peter and to give him a place of prominence. In the upper room, Peter had said to Jesus, if you remember this in chapter 13, he said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" And Jesus had said to him, "Where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow me later." And Peter replies to him, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Peter went from the braggadocious manner in the upper room of saying, "If everybody else forsakes you, I will die for you, Jesus," to later on in the outer court of the high priest denying Jesus 3 times. And so Jesus is now going to restore Peter by asking him a series of questions. And I think this has a profound influence in Peter's life, because later when Peter writes an epistle to the churches in 1 Peter, one of the key commands he gives in that epistle is to shepherd the flock of God, which echoes what Jesus essentially commissions Peter here to do. Peter, in many ways, receives in this passage a second commission, much like Jonah did in the book of Jonah. And incidentally, the Gospel of Matthew says that Peter's father is, in fact, named Jonah. It's one letter difference. Here it's recorded as John, but Jonah was sometimes an alternate of that name. And so Peter receives a second commission, and we'll see that as we go along. So let's look here first at verses 15 to 17. And here we see that Jesus restores Peter for service. Jesus restores Peter for service. So they have breakfast, they've eaten their fish, and now Jesus says to Simon, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? It's significant that 3 times Jesus addresses Peter this way, Simon, son of John. I think it's intended to echo the opening of the gospel in John chapter 1, when Jesus first calls Peter. He uses the same name to address him. In John 1:42, it says that Andrew brought him, Peter, to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon the son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which means hearer. I think it's significant because what Jesus does there is he changes Peter's name from Simon to Peter. And in doing that, he's showing that he is calling Peter to be a disciple. He's giving him a new name and a new identity. But here, he refers to Peter again as Simon, son of John. And I wonder if this is to hint that Peter has sort of receded back to his old lifestyle. Remember, he had gone back to fishing. And so it's almost like Jesus is setting the clock back to 0 and now calling him Simon, son of John, and once more inviting Peter to be his disciple. And so Jesus begins this conversation and he asks him, do you love me more than these? Now, if you've ever heard a message on this particular passage, you may have heard that Jesus and Peter use different words for love in this passage, and sometimes interpreters make a lot of that distinction. I don't think that necessarily is the key to the passage so much as the fact that Jesus repeats the question 3 times in slightly different ways each time. And in fact, not only is the word love, not only are 2 words used for the word love, but also for the word sheep, also for the word know, and also for the word feed. And so there's a lot of variety within the passage. And I think the point is, Jesus is simply inescapably asking Peter, do you really love me? And the point is that Peter had said earlier that he loved Jesus essentially more than all the disciples. He said, if everybody else leaves, I'm the guy who's going to lay down his life for you. And in chapter 13, I had suggested that 3 times Peter resists Jesus to show that Jesus is the good shepherd, not Peter. Peter is not the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. Jesus is. And so here in this passage as well, Jesus is again commissioning Peter and asking him, is it true that you love me more than these? Now, there's a lot of question about what exactly Jesus means here. We could take this 3 different ways. When he says, do you love me more than these? He could be saying, do you love me more than you love these other people? In other words, are you more devoted to me than you're devoted to the other disciples? And we know that Jesus does say this at other places, that whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. That is to say that if you follow Jesus, he